The registration. Okay, perfect. Welcome, everybody. A warm welcome to you to this first event of the webinar series on federalism and the law of diversity. First of all, I would like to tell you that these events are registered and also live streamed on YouTube on the YouTube channel of the Institute for Comparative Federalism of URAC Research. And my name is Nicolò Paolo Alessi, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Verona and at the Institute of Federalism of the University of Fribourg, and junior researcher at the Institute for Comparative Federalism at URAC Research. I will moderate these three events of this webinar series, which has been organized with the support of the University of Verona, the Institute of Federalism of Fribourg, and the Institute for Comparative Federalism at URAC Research. And this webinar series is also part of the activities of the IACL research group, Constitutionalism and Societal Pluralism. Let me also welcome our today's speakers, whom I'm very much pleased to introduce to you. And today, the first person who will be speaking is Martina Trettel, who is senior researcher at the Institute for Comparative Federalism at URAC Research. And Martina holds a PhD degree in Constitutional and European Legal Studies from the University of Verona. And her main research interests are institutional innovations and participatory democracy, fiscal federalism, federal and regional studies, and comparative constitutional justice. Then our second speaker will be Jared Sonicsen, who is lecturer and researcher at the Institute for Political Science of the Technical University of Darmstadt. He got a PhD in political science at the University of Bonn, and his research mainly deals with comparative government and politics, democracy theories, comparative federalism, and political systems. The third person that will be taking the floor today as a discussant is Francesco Palermo. He is former legal advisor of the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities, former president of the advisory committee under the Framework Convention on National Minorities, and former senator. He is currently full professor for comparative public law at the University of Verona, constitutional advisor of the Council of Europe's Congress of Local and Regional Authorities, member of the Scientific Committee of the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union, and head of the Institute for Comparative Federalism at URAC Research. And just let me address a few words about the organization of this webinar. I will provide a little introduction about the subject we will address today. And then afterwards, Martina Trettel's and Jared Sonicsen's presentations will last around 20 minutes. Afterwards, Francesco Palermo will take the floor and comment on their speeches for around 10-15 minutes. Then we will open the floor for a further discussion based on the speakers' reaction to the comments and on questions by the audience, which are absolutely welcomed. Those who would like to participate, asking a question or leaving a comment, may write in the chat tab, and we will please to give them the floor. Also, written comments and questions are welcomed. We will collect them and pass to the speakers. So thank you very much. And as I said, before leaving the floor to our speakers, allow me to say some introductory words about the subject that are dealt with in this webinar series. First of all, this webinar series addresses what we may define as emerging models for the accommodation of diversity in constitutional states, and aims to investigate whether and to which extent federalism may provide a contribution to their theoretical framing. When we speak about emergent models for the accommodation of diversity, we refer to contemporary patterns of diversity management, which to various degrees diverge from the minority rights traditional models and integrate them. They can be seen as representing a new legal approach to diversity, which is based on a different conception of what diversity means today. We indeed know that diversity, meaning a differential condition based on cultural or other grounds, has had varied treatments in constitutional traditions. Indeed, from a diachronical perspective, diversity, for example, was ignored by liberal constitutionalism in its pursuit of formal equality, while liberal democratic constitutionalism has increasingly dealt with it and in terms of protection of minority rights. Today, the models of minority rights law and their theoretical underpinnings are put under pressure as diversity is getting growing significance as a general and complex phenomenon that affects our contemporary societies. In other words, the need and the demand for the accommodation of diversity are not limited to minorities only today. And in a way, law and constitutionalism are somewhat mirroring this trend, since it's possible to observe the emergence of theoretical models and practices which take into account diversity as a societal and comprehensive element of our society, shine away from its conflation with minorities. These models can be maybe framed as models of a pluralist constitutionalism. Therefore, to capture these described trends, we use the phrase law of diversity. This phrase is specifically intended to propose a unitary conceptual framework that reconnects traditional and contemporary perspective in these fields, highlighting that they are anyhow part of the same phenomenon, namely the legal accommodation of societal factors of diversity. And in particular, and more importantly, using this phrase specifically suggests that we refrain from framing diversity management only through the lens of minority rights. In this series, we will draw our attention to three models, and today to participatory democracy, that although some of them may have ancient origins, today may be seen as emergent models for the accommodation of diversity. Our goal is to look for theoretical instruments to frame them in order to better understand, explain them, and also foster their evolution. This is a general thing, I guess. Any emergent phenomena that have a legal significance needs solid theoretical grounds to grow and express its potential. And this is where federalism enters the stage. Indeed, in these three webinars, and today as regards participatory democracy, we will attempt to verify if federalism may be employed as an analytical tool, an interpretive paradigm, and a theoretical lens through which one can frame these models. Well, this is not at all a simple endeavor because it requires us to distance ourselves from the predominant approach to federalism, an approach that looks at it as meaning a form of territorial government. Contrarily, we here want to verify the theoretical potential of federalism as an analytical tool and a practical source of inspiration for the development of these emerging models. The basic idea is that federalism is the most structured method for the accommodation of pluralism. And for this reason, it could have the theoretical potential to give inspiration and explanation to these models that somewhat follow a similar logic. Concretely, a federal framing may lead us to see this model as expressing a federal logic, and may imply the introduction and use of a federal semantics, for example, that can help us explain them and empower their development. Finally, these considerations could bring, if they prove correct or verified, could bring a rethinking of the common and reassuring conceptual categories concerning minority rights and federalism. And this rethinking may somewhat bring closer federalism and minority rights and show their deep connections based on a common theoretical ground consisting of the concept of pluralism and governance. So, as our title suggests, in other words, we may therefore end up acknowledging that rather than being theoretically separated and occasionally connected islands, federalism and the law of diversity are part of an archipelago where pluralism and governance may be seen as the stretches of sand that bridge them below the surface of the water. So this is my little introduction, and let me now give the floor to Martina Trettel for her presentation. I very much look forward to listen to this presentation, and all your reactions and interactions will be absolutely welcomed. Martina Trettel presentation title is Reflecting on Democratic Innovations Through Federalism, Citizen Participation, Power Sharing, and Decision-Making Processes. And thank you, Martina, and I hand you over to her.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Thank you all for being here and for having invited me in this very interesting webinar today. So first of all, let me share my screen with my presentation. I hope you can hear me well. Can you see my presentation? Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So first of all, thank you. I want to also thank Nicola, because he actually introduced us by saying that this is not an easy task, what he asked us. So I have to confirm his statement, because reflecting on participatory democracy through federalism is definitely not an easy task. It was not the first time for me in this endeavor, because it's a long time that I'm trying to reflect on the connections between federalism and participatory democracy. And what I would like to do here today in the next about 20 minutes, I will try to be as short as possible, is to look at specifically democratic innovations. In a few minutes, I will explain you why I specifically decided to address the issue of democratic innovations and not the definition participatory democracy, through the lens of federalism and decentralization. So I hope what I will say will be clear, even if I know, and this is a premise, that this issue can be very controversial and is very risky to talk about these theoretical issues that can be looked at from many perspectives. So please consider my presentation as food for thought and as a basis for discussion, because I think, as I discussed with Nicola many times, that this is a partly unexplored issue. So I hope there will be a chance to discuss about this and to further develop our ideas together today. So my presentation deals with democratic innovations. I decided to adopt this terminology because in the last few years, I found this definition from Elstab and Escobar, which you can see at the bottom of my slide, which I think is the most precise definition of what deliberative and participatory democracy is. So a summary of the encounter between participatory and deliberative democracy. So in this perspective, democratic innovation can be considered as an umbrella term that encompasses processes or institutions that are new to a policy issue, policy role, or level of governance, and developed to reimagine and deepen the role of citizens in governance processes by increasing opportunities for participation, deliberation, and influence. So I think this definition summarizes very well what in recent times is referred at with different terminologies. For example, in Italy, we use very much the term democrazia partecipativa, so participatory democracy, whereas in other contexts, the term deliberative democracy is more used. So I think in an international context, the term democratic innovations can represent a common ground, adopting, of course, this specific definition for different disciplines and different national backgrounds. So looking at the proliferation of democratic innovations throughout the world, I think there are several readings of this phenomenon that still remain partly unexplored. I say that because when studying democratic innovations, you can find a lot of research on very specific issues, for example, the design of democratic innovations, the outputs of democratic innovations, somehow the effects of democratic innovations, but many other perspectives are not fully explored yet. One of them is the interaction between decentralization of powers or federalism and the start or the advent of democratic innovations. In fact, here I can say that federalism could be one influential element for the further development of democratic innovations practices. Having these as the basis of my analysis, as the basic thought of my analysis, I identified three specific perspectives of analysis. Looking at, of course, the research that is nowadays available with regard to democratic innovations in multi-level countries. So the first perspective we can look at refers to the level of government in which democratic innovations take place. I will then address these three perspectives more in detail. Here, just to have to give you an overview of the three perspectives I identified in my research. So the first one, I decided to use questions in order to also give you the idea of my thinking process in developing this presentation. So first of all, I asked myself if the level of government in which democratic innovations take place play a role on the performance of the democratic innovations in the decision-making processes. The second perspective of the analysis has to do with the decentralization of lawmaking power on different levels of government. And I ask myself if the distribution of decision-making powers on different levels of government can influence the accommodation of democratic innovation in institutional frameworks. And the third question and the third perspective of analysis has to do with the analogies that we can find. And I think this is the perspective in which Nicolas is most interested in, has to do with the analogies we can find between the theories of federalism and those on democratic innovations. So can we find any analogies? And if yes, how can this perspective, this point of view be useful? So let's start with the first perspective, the one that I called here democratic innovations in multi-level countries. So this is, I would say, the basic perspective. Because if we look at research on democratic innovations in multi-level countries, we can often see that what is argued is that democratic innovations better take roots and proliferate in multi-level structures of government, given the greater range of government levels. So in other words, we can say that decentralized countries, so regional and federal countries, offer more levels of government, and as a consequence, they offer more occasions for democratic instruments to take roots and proliferate. This often induces to approach the analysis searching for experiences on the lower levels of government, mainly for quantitative reasons, so looking at local and subnational level of government without properly considering the higher levels of government, like the national or the supranational level. And I ask myself if this reading of the phenomenon is accurate. So here we can say that yes, decentralized countries are of course valid containers for the development of democratic innovations, because if there are more levels of government, there are multiple occasions for democratic innovations to proliferate, as said. However, I think this is a very simplistic perspective, because there is no evidence that democratic innovations function worse in unitary countries or, of course, better in multi-level countries. Quite the contrary. If we look at the evidence of democratic innovations throughout Europe, for example, we can see that many unitary countries, for example, France, but also Iceland and Ireland, show us how these can commit to the effective employment of democratic innovations, and let us understand that the elements that really influence the development and the proper routing of democratic innovations in societies are elements that has to do with politics, with cultural heritage, with social conditions. So I don't think that, of course, this is very basic, as I was saying, but the perspective in which we say in multi-level countries that are many levels of government in which democratic instruments can take place is not enough to address the issue of decentralization and democratic innovations. However, these perspectives shed light on one important element of democratic innovation, which is the dimensional scale of a constituency in the proper functioning of democratic innovations. In fact, if we look at the evidence with regard to democratic innovations, we see that these take place mostly in municipalities because these have a smaller scale than subnational and national levels of government. Let's think, for example, at a participatory budgeting or a citizen jury that take place in a municipality having 20,000 citizens. This is, of course, different than organizing a citizens' assembly at the national level of government, where we have like millions and millions of inhabitants. And of course, this is also confirmed by the fact that, for example, the democratic innovations that were activated in Iceland and in Ireland for amending the constitution, so these are very famous processes of democratic innovations, took place in very small countries. So Ireland and Iceland, as we know, are very small countries. So of course, the the dimensional scale of a constituency is important when we look at democratic innovations, but in my perspective, the fact that a country is decentralized or not has not this big of an influence in the development and in the proper functioning of democratic innovations. We can move on to the second perspective. So the decentralization of powers, so of decision-making powers to subnational units, and the possibility of institutionalizing democratic innovations. Of course, here we can see a bigger role for regional and federal countries, because if we are aware of the panorama of democratic innovations throughout the world, we know that the institutionalization of democratic innovations in legal acts is something very rather uncommon. In fact, normally democratic innovations are ad hoc experiences or one-shot experiences. However, we also know that those cases where democratic innovations were institutionalized through legal acts, in these cases, democratic innovations had somehow a higher qualitative standard, their opportunity to exert some actual influence were upgraded, and it is also important to institutionalize democratic innovation in order to give to these instruments more credibility and more transparency in the eyes of citizens. So what we can say here is that democratic innovations were institutionalized mostly in subnational units of regional or federal countries. To this extent, we can see, for example, that in Tuscany, an Italian region, in 2007, a general law on participatory democracy was adopted, which was a very important act, a very important statement for the development of democratic innovations. This example was followed by Aragon in Spain, and also in different Länder in Austria, like for example in Vorarlberg or in Salzburg. Also in Austria, what is interesting to see is that the concept of participatory democracy made it to the subnational constitution. So recently, subnational constitutions, again in Vorarlberg and in Salzburg, were amended in order to introduce the concept in the subnational constitution. So to this extent, we can say that the decentralization of legislative powers, which is a characteristic of decentralized countries like regional and federal countries, has a concrete influence on the development of legal models for democratic innovations, transforming subnational units into actual innovation laboratories for democratic innovations. So the allocation of powers on several levels of government and the decentralized structure of a country can actually help democratic innovation take root in legal structure, although, again, this is not a necessary precondition. So, third perspective I want to address here is the one in which we looked at democratic innovations and federalism in a more theoretical way. In fact, I decided to put on my slide as a first quote this interesting sentence from El-Azhar from 1987, where he states that federal democracy views the constitutional sharing of powers among multiple centers as the keystone of popular government. Reflecting on this sentence, I realized that somehow democratic innovations and federalism partly pursue the same goal, which is the sharing of decision-making powers among multiple centers in a way people, so citizens, when it comes to democratic innovations, and in the other way, in the other perspective, the one of federalism among territories, in order to get to the same goal. So to open up sovereignty for the improvement of democratic procedures and government. I ask myself how, and maybe then Nicolò can help us develop a little bit on this question. How is this approach, or can this approach be useful for the further development of democratic innovations? Because it is, of course, what I'm interested in. But maybe Nicolò could also ask himself if this approach could be useful for the further development of federalism. I don't know. And I realized that democratic innovations could be intended, similarly to federalism, as a set of governance tools that aspire at renewing traditional representative structures, integrating additional levels and phases of decision-making. In this perspective, in this conception, federalism and its way of dealing with complex issues through institutional means and flexible solution can be seen as a matrix for the further development of theories on democratic innovations and for the development of the studies on democratic innovations in order to transform these also in a set of governance tools to be employed for devising valid answers to the growing demands for pluralist democracy, meaning more participatory, more inclusive, and multi-level democracy. So to this extent, I think we can see many analogies, but maybe what is missing and what I'm finding hard to identify is the way in which these analogies can be made useful for the further development of both research fields, democratic innovations and federalism. So I'm coming to an end slowly. Here, these are not actually final remarks. This is just a summary of what I just said, and maybe this comparative perspective can be useful for seeing the three perspectives I addressed in the beginning, and I discussed about a little bit in the last 15 minutes. So the first perspective I identified, I define it as a descriptive perspective in which we use decentralization as a lens through which it is possible to observe democratic innovations. And this has been done mainly for descriptive purposes. For example, to understand how different democratic innovation practices take different shapes and forms based on the level of government where they occur. Again, with regard, for example, to the scale, the dimension of our constituency. However, democratic innovations work in both decentralized and unitary countries. And again, what is mostly important are other elements like institutional, cultural, and political elements that play a much more central role in the performance of democratic innovations. The second perspective is an institutional one, in which we looked at decentralization of powers. And I realized that the decentralization of powers is actually a support for developing legal frameworks that can accommodate democratic innovations. In this regard, subnational entities function as innovation laboratories for the experimentation of democratic innovations to be then copied and rearranged from other subnational units through a comparative activity or even other levels of government. And the third perspective is the theoretical one, in which I realized that democratic innovations and federalism pursue the sharing of powers among multiple decision-making centers, the first one horizontally and the second one vertically, to guarantee more pluralism and diversity, and at the same time to enhance the functionality and the legitimacy of representative democracy. So a change of perspective for transforming democratic innovations into a methodology will undeniably represent a big step forward in this field of research. So thank you very much. I hope it was clear enough. If not, I hope there will be a chance to discuss and debate about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Thank you very much for your intriguing presentation. It was really interesting and very, very clear, at least as far as I'm concerned. Three-dimensional analyses were really clear and interesting, but as you said, the third dimension is what maybe we are looking for in this webinar and in the next ones in general about these deep connections. You put very important premises, I guess, and the very challenge is to go beyond that, I think. And with these words, I will leave the floor to Jared Sonicson. Thank you very much. And the title of Jared's presentation is Archipelago or Tectonic Plates, Exploring the Coupling Between Federalism and Participatory Democracy. Thank you very much, Jared.
Thank you very much. I will also then start with the presentation. 1 second. Okay, that seems to have worked.
It works, yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much to everybody for being here. Thank you for that excellent presentation to Martina, and also to Nicola for the kind, not only the kind introduction, but also very thought-provoking as well. So in my presentation, I've been inspired quite a lot by the concept of this webinar series and the description when preparing the description beforehand of what the web series is doing, and now even more so in retrospect, also by what Nicolo said as introduction, and also what Martina's already presented. I think in some parts, some of what I have to say already talks to each other a bit, and I don't have anything to add that would in any shape or form go against what Martina has said, but maybe a couple of things that add a different perspective. So I come from, I guess, one of the more conventional backgrounds, and all the more so dealing with established federal democracies. And nevertheless, I hope to add, maybe coming from this point of departure, also some more food for thought to add on the guiding question for today and the challenges. A bit of that will be maybe raising some further critical questions to think about that I look forward to discussing with all of you. A large part of what I want to present, and that's the first image, is on federalism and democracy in general, their relationship, and where they're to deal with these two. Well, the first image that has been provided was this beautiful image of archipelago between different systems or system types. But that also applies at an ideational level between concepts. I juxtapose this now here, coming from this federalism and democracy background that I have, with another image of tectonic plates. So where two different systems can rub against each other. And so the image of the fault line. Now, a fault line, of course, is not an earthquake, right? But it has a potential. And that's sort of this idea here that there can be frictions or contradictions. And so that's what I will talk about in the first part, and probably the larger part, though I'll try not to be too long. Where's that common ground, that sand connecting the islands? Where's that, and oftentimes below the surface? And where, on the other hand, might those tectonic plates be as well? My hope is that this reflection also prompts further reflection on moving forward. What are some of the lessons that we can learn for the guiding questions at hand? One concept that I want to present, I have more slides than I will talk about, is about this concept of coupling. So the linkages between these two in one system, between federalism and democracy. And then the second part, I will delve into a bit federalism and participatory democracy. And here in the end, I outline a few possibilities, but also raise some questions as food for thought, and end with a conclusion. Similar to Martina, I also have 3 perspectives that I do in the conclusion. Also one more descriptive, and one conceptual, as well as a normative one. So I've added this next slide a couple of sources. The 2 on the right is more of the resource that embodies where this coupling concept that I present comes from, namely from Arthur Vence, who I worked with for several years at TU Darmstadt as my mentor during my postdoc qualification. His newest book presents this concept of coupling, and theoretically and also based on a number of case studies, again, in established federal democracies. We did together a book then below on the right that adapts this also then in English to several other countries, that works with other scholars and case studies. But to the left, here are books that are inspiring for me, and also all the more so, recommendations to read. One is this excellent book, the second one at the bottom, Power Sharing in Europe, that I think deals with a lot of these questions we're concerned with today, and also in the web series in the next 3 sessions. And in the upper left is an excellent book on citizen participation in multi-level democracies that I highly recommend, and was inspiring for me as well. So let's get to that tension between archipelago and tectonic plates, federalism and democracy. So what do they have in common? Well, there's this longstanding ideas that federalism and democracy sort of reinforce one another, that they're mutually compatible. And at the bottom line, I think one reason for that, and this long history of ideas and that is recurring, is that they have so much in common. They divide powers, right? Martina mentioned Elazar, non-centralization and power sharing, and this is common to federalism, but also we could say to democracy. Self-rule and self-determination in some form is common to both. At the same time, also sharing rules, so not only autonomy, but also sharing rule. At the core, at least classically, some notion or understanding of equality of the constituents, the basic units, that these are equal participants in the polity or community, and that there are forms of representation and involved representation with participation of these constituents. So there's a lot of compatibility there between federalism and democracy. But there are also, we could say, contradictions, or at least tensions. And they derive, on the one hand, from them being 2 distinct forms of government, or dimensions of government. They both involve dividing powers, but most conventionally, one is rather vertical between levels of government, federalism, and one rather horizontal between, let's say, branches of government, executive and legislative. Another dimension I add in here is temporality, that sort of cuts across the dimensions, a special dimension to add into time, their development over time. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. So the two refer their ordering principles, even if they share some of these common ordering principles, right, in names. Their reference, what they're referring to, are different. To put it in a nutshell, let's say they refer to people and places, democracy rather to the people, and federalism, at least conventionally or most conventionally, classically, to places, constituent territories. So that combination in one political system can multiply the good, right? Division of power, limited authority, shared powers, and equality, but it can also lead to tensions and even those frictions when they come into interaction because they're following different logics. And at the same time, to point out, I think is important, not just with democracy, but also with federalism, there are variants. So there's not just the federalism and there's not just the democracy, but within each dimension, there's a spectrum of whether power is separated or shared, whether the orientation is towards self or shared rule, and whether the impetus or drive is to compete, to go it alone, or to cooperate. Here is sort of a systematization, an attempt at a systematization of what are those reference points then, those common features for federalism, democracy. Again, this is a simplified dichotomy with people being democracy and federalism being places. Obviously, it's oversimplified because democracy is always bound to a territory, right? And federalism is maybe about places, but it would have no meaning in places that are unpopulated, right? So it is an oversimplification, but I hope a little bit helpful, at least to point out where can also be some tensions between the two and what those reference are of those common ordering principles. So with regard to their relationship, how do we gauge or understand their relationship? Is again, well, if we ask, how do they get along with each other? Are they in conflict or not? One of the first questions is, of course, from the outset then, well, which federalism would we be talking about in the first place? Because there's different ones, or which democracy for that matter. Cutting across is, if we're thinking normatively, lessons to learn, for example, at latest, there are policy questions. I mean, governing is always about solving problems, not just solving problems. It's about fulfilling values and principles as well, representing identities and so many other things. But there are concrete things that governments have to do. So if we're thinking about specific policies, and we want to know, is this a democratic or a federal question? Or asked in another way, does one promise to improve the other or not? If this is a democratic question, would it be better served if it was also federally organized, or vice versa? If it's a federal question, would a democratic way, in addition, also help us to do this better? Whatever that means, if not more effectively, then more representatively. With regard to diversity and accommodation, and again, I admit I'm coming more from this conventional dealing with established federalism and democracies. And Nicolo pointed out, with this newer concept of law of diversity, there's some exciting avenues to go. But nevertheless, drawing on what I know or a bit of my familiarity, federalism is often seen as a way to accommodate diversity. And here this factor of time comes in, I think, depending on when a federation, for example, was formed. That may have been the case, that it was supposed to accommodate diversity, or at some point a country decentralizes or regionalizes because of regional differences. But what if those places change? What if the people who live there change? And to a certain extent, a federalization of a political community may create diversity as a result, a type of diversity based on these state or Länder or cantons that might not be there later, if that makes sense. So there's a certain kind of diversity, a plurality or multiplication that federalism also actually, from an institutional perspective over time, creates and maybe even perpetuates. So I think I've made this point, so I'll be very brief about this point about there being different kinds of democracy and what democracy is referring to, because it encompasses, let's say, a form of government with how the executive and legislative is organized. It has to do with politics and structure. So how do parties work? What are the rules of election? And the different kinds of dynamics that can go in hand with that, whether it's oriented towards winner takes all or more towards inclusion and consociation or purports consensus democracy. Many of you probably know the modern classic lie part with majoritarianism versus consensus democracy. And the logics of operation then, so they behave differently based on not determined, but also influenced by how those institutions are configured. And the same goes again for federalism. You know, the division of powers may be between primarily levels of government, but they may take quite different forms, whether they're more dualistic, so strictly separated, or cooperative in nature. Are they symmetric? All regions enjoy the same rights, or some others enjoy special privileges? Is the system oriented towards protecting autonomy or mitigating differences, right? So is it protecting difference, or is it, on the one hand, what are those differences? Or is it a way of, is a system oriented towards reducing, for example, socioeconomic differences? So as I pointed out, while federalism may be referred to places conventionally or primarily a vertical, there's a multidimensionality in each dimension to an extent. Democracy is vertical because it's not only between branches of government, but also between the government and the people. There's that dimension. And of course, there's horizontality to federalism. So not only vertical between levels of government, but also in the relations between those constituent units, be they regions, cantons, states, what have you. And another point I'd like to add in is temporality. It's a bit more difficult to add into that space, two-dimensional space, but how people are organized, people and places are organized is, of course, very important to both dimensions of government. A federal constitution, for example, is a compact, or also very fond of Elazar, who uses this term covenant, a pact between generations over time. While inherent to democracy is also a certain democratic time, right? A time that sets deadlines, often very short ones, when decisions have to be made, for example. So there's two different sorts of time constraints. The federal constitution maybe makes it difficult for changes, certainly by simple majorities, to be reached, while democratic time may require quicker changes. In this multidimensionality comes another, let's say, more dynamic-based one, based on interaction, that there will be actions and interaction behind those lines, behind those boundaries of where, between them and beyond them in a system of democratic federalism. So I think that says enough about that there will be some tensions between the two, between federalism and democracy, already in the conventional systems that we know of, that when it comes to making decisions, that it's not always easy to know. It's can be even a dilemma, which organizational principle takes precedence over another when they come to conflict. Or another area of tensions is, of course, when there are problems or challenges that cut across jurisdictions, and most modern problems are cross-jurisdictional ones. I mean, climate change is one of the most drastic and current ones, but any infrastructural issue is almost always somehow cross-jurisdictional. So even those more technical ones. So different constituencies will be affected, and it will not always be easy to resolve whether the federal logic or the democratic logic contributes to resolving those problems, or can increase the tensions and even cause those tectonic frictions between these two ways of doing politics. That's what the concept of coupling then gets at. And so the takeaway is, and I won't go anywhere near as much into this as the slide suggests. But the takeaway is that coupling is a concept adopted from Arthur Benz, as I'd mentioned, that captures that intensity of linkage between two different dimensions of government, the democratic institutions and the federal ones. So these can be in institutions, or they may be more functionally based. The law, the Constitution requires that there's cooperation or that each unit is responsible on its own. They can also be of a more procedural or kind of interactive nature. Different bodies of peoples want to cooperate with another or law requires to them, but there's also de facto interlinkage or interaction that results. I mean, if two separate units make decisions on their own in their autonomous regions, it may have an effect on nonetheless, and a so-called externality that may go across the border, right? So externalities are not limited within the boundaries where the decisions are made. So there's some sort of effect within a community, even a federally organized one, that goes across boundaries. So there can be this de facto interaction that may require interaction and cooperation between actors and institutions. And what that intensity of linkage is, that may be interesting to go into further from a more comparative federalism democracy, comparative politics perspective. I won't do that here. Suffice it to say, in the framework, there are three different kinds of types that have been conceptualized, whether it's decoupled or loosely coupled, whether federalism and democracy are tightly coupled with another or rather loosely coupled. And again, I want to skip that because the takeaway is really this idea that there can also be frictions and challenges. The kind of classical conventional institutions we would look at to see how tightly coupled, loosely coupled, or uncoupled federalism and democracy are these usual suspects kind of institutions: the party system, the second chamber, fiscal federalism, the system of intergovernmental relations, and so party networks. But that's not really what we're interested in here now, and I would like to switch away from the conventional democratic perspective and talk a bit about federalism and participatory democracy. Let me start with participatory democracy. Really brief, most of you, if not all of you, already know about this, if not more than I do for certain. But if that's the case, then as a primer, so to speak, we have these conventional, or maybe conventional, old-fashioned would be a better term, ideas of participatory democracy that were limited to direct democracy. Meanwhile, long-established form of democracy beyond representative democracy, conventional voting in elections. So direct democracy, referenda would be maybe the supposedly most typical, though one could argue this is not really what participatory democracy is getting at. But often in these discussions about participatory democracy, ways of more direct democracy, also through plebiscites are discussed. And there are numerous kinds of plebiscites. They don't have to be just a referendum. I mean, they could be voting on public budgets. And that gets us more in that direction of participatory democracy. So not just a referendum, but other forms of voting beyond classic elections. I'd say long-established form of participatory democracy is lived in those places that have local and regional councils. Town hall meetings is sort of a famous example of really participatory governance at local level, at least. But there are many other variants of participatory democracy. Deliberative democracy has already been spoken about, and Martina knows, is the expert, I believe, in the room on this. And in addition to that, and there's some overlap about how deliberative these other fora or forums are: citizen assemblies, forms of consultations or mediation on an ad hoc basis. So there might be rules to mediate when there are problems of various groups, shareholders in a community, to mediate then in public with public decision makers. as well as forms that break this input-output cycle of politics from the vote and waiting for laws to appear, inclusionary forms of getting people involved in, for example, administration, so that they can be involved in planning procedures. I mean, even forms of petition could go in this direction, having ombudsmen or ombudswomen to speak with, but also more intense ways, like being involved in a planning commission or other administrative inclusionary forms. There are newer, renewed forms of participatory democracy. I mean, e-democracy, liquid democracy. Aleatoric democracy is an old and renewed sort of form, so people being chosen by lot to be in public positions. And perhaps a second form, new or renewed form, it goes a bit in the direction of federalism, I would say, in participatory democracy, these sort of more left-wing communitarian idealized forms from the late 19th century, and that were renewed again in recent decades, be it anarcho-syndicalism, Soviet, or some sort of committee formed of republic, very decentralized, or democratic federalism, confederalism. Murray Bookchin, he was a popular thinker in that regard. So there's a lot of stuff a lot of ideas out there, a lot of already established elements of participatory democracy. Now, why do the two, what's the sort of natural compatibility or endemic conduciveness between the two, between federalism and participatory democracy? And here I can reiterate a number of things that Martina already spoke about, this non-centralization concept, decentralization structures. These are also very classical ideas behind federalism, at least from democratic supporters of federalism, which you already find in Montesquieu, de Tocqueville, that federalism reinforces democracy because it multiplies the spaces and places for participation. So it institutionalizes from the outset forms of regional and local self-governance. There's also a connex here between federalism and certain forms of pluralism, corporatism, and consociationalism. Leipart and Edelzar had a debate once in the Journal of Federalism about commonalities and differences between consociationalism and federalism. So there are variable defined communities in a federal system, and again, the conventional primary one being territorial, but there are also other forms of federal organization or federalist type organization along ethnic, linguistic, and religious lines, but they can also be maybe even more functional or sectoral. That might be an interesting point to latch onto, also with a view to new forms of diversity or conceptualizing diversity that are not just minority rights oriented. And in that book I mentioned citizen participation, multi-level democracies. There's an interesting chapter in there. I mean, they're all interesting, but one that came to mind when putting this together was Sabrina Krupp, who specifically elaborated on possible linkages between associative democracy and federalism. So federalism has a compatibility with participation in general, also in these dual senses, that you have a whole, but that's fostering a participation, both in the sense of taking part in your collective self-destiny and having part in there. And I'm getting close to the end now. And so some food for thought, some questions to think about, perhaps. How do we, and to whom do we apply this? For example, as a cross-cutting question, this federal toolkit from Francesco Palermo and Karl Kirstler. Well, one question to think about is, which kinds of federalism do we mean then? Do we want more autonomy preserving or more joint rule, joint decision-making, federalism that we are oriented towards? Is it a more internal-oriented channels of participation within a specific kind of constituent unit, be it territorial-based, but we could define this in another way, but some sort of unit? And is the look to participatory democracy an inspiration for enhancing internal participation? Or are we interested in fostering these linkages that go, and inclusion that go between these and across these units and bodies, which I would say is also a potential federal lesson. So this idea that federalism is autonomy serving is one-sided, I'd say. That's not in reference directly to Palermo and Koestler, but this is now building on that question of the federal toolkit. What are some more questions that we can raise from that? Which kind of distribution of participatory rights, on the other hand? How do we organize this? Do we follow an all affected principle or an all subjected principle? So all those who are affected, whether they are citizens or not, or those who are subjected, irrespective of if there are people affected outside of that unit by the decisions made by that participatory mode. So what's the route of inclusion that we use to organize more participation? Are we interested in symmetric, the allocation of new or better or enhanced rights to all citizens? Must they be citizens? What about residents? Or asymmetric, special, privileged, certain rights for certain groups and so forth. And a cross-cutting question, I come back to this time issue, is how do we adapt for future diversity? Are there ways to inbuild rules and procedures that allow for change later on? I mean, what one lesson from federalism is typically to make change, at least formal change, more difficult than organic change. Like regular laws are much easier to change in the federal system than the Constitution or the compact that requires supermajorities. So how do we deal with this? We know at some point communities change, and what is diverse now, there will be different diversities later. So how do we build in adaptation for future diversity? So I'll jump to now the conclusion. So on the more empirical descriptive note from all of that, the bottom line is a very simple one. There's not just one model of a federal democracy, and not just the one participatory democratic federalism. So the endeavor should be, how do we find more patterns, whether ideationally conceptual or ones that may be out there of also federal democracy and participatory democratic federalism. What I think is an important takeaway, though, too, is at the same time, there is always going to be some sort of tension, irrespective of the form of a federal organization or irrespective of the form of democratic organization, when you combine these two in one political system. So that's, I think, an important lesson to have on our radar. Another conceptual note, and this is very broad, but I thought this would be a good place to throw this on the board, is, and inspired by the archipelago, in a geographic sense, how do we navigate these challenges? And I spoke about people and places on the one hand, democracy and federalism on the one hand, but again, all political communities are territorial based somehow on the one hand, and at the same time involve people, otherwise it wouldn't be political. So at least the compass, one compass we have to have in our minds potentially is not only the people and places dimension, but also locating between principles and problems on this field of cardinal directions we have to navigate when thinking about linking federalism to democratic participation. And on a more normative note, and I'm probably preaching to the choir, more federalist organization can enhance democracy, but not necessarily. And the same would go for federalism, that more participation will not necessarily mean a better federalism, which is not to say that that's not what we should be looking for, but just to say that a warning that probably nobody needs is to that we can't expect that more will be better of one or the other. Federalism and democracy, especially federalism, has often been autonomy and self-determination oriented, and for good reason, but it's also important to keep in mind, and I say this is a lot of federalist thinkers that we can draw on that remind us of that also federalism, like democracy, is interested in comity, so holding together and equality, whether we think in the lines of Scanlon, what do we owe each other, or thinking of an archipelago, but no person is an island. They are also connected, also islands. And we need to link and balance these things to make them work. So self-rule, but also shared rule, and ways that not only preserve the islands that exist, but also that foster the bridges that connect them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jared. That was really a thought-provoking speech, and you touched upon some fundamental issues. And really thank you. I guess that you made it clear that that there are so many dimensions we have to take into account when engaging with these concepts. What I found interesting is also the idea that the federal toolkit can be useful sometimes in order to provide some models for innovations. So the idea of the flexible forms of communities composing our societies can apply very well to our situations in which diversity is being kind of a complex and dynamic element of our societies. So thank you very much. And I will now pass the floor to Francesco Palermo, who will give us his comments on the presentations. Please, Francesco. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you all. And well, I don't know whether I should really thank you, Nicola, because it's a hot potato, the one you gave me. It is actually difficult to comment on these two brilliant presentations, and they were really very inspiring in a number of aspects. I took notes, so I deliberately didn't prepare anything in advance. I just wanted to listen to the presentations, and I came up with some points, and I do apologize if these points are not too much linked together, but I will try to find a kind of a common trait on what has been said, and trying to add my 2 cents on that. So the first point is the more general one, and that derives already from the introduction that Nicola gave, and basically from the whole research question which is behind this series of webinars. What to do with aging concepts that get old by a natural process of aging. I've been thinking a little bit about these things, and it seems to me, if I can put it a little bit provocatively, that the topic is really so innovative that it turns out to be simple. What do I mean by that? Because there is a process of obsolescence of traditional concepts. And here in particular, of course, we are dealing with the concepts of federalism and minority rights, both very strong, very rooted, but also, they kind of show that they are getting old in a way. But in general, this is a recurring issue in constitutional law, and I would say in law in general, and not to mention political science, which I'm not an expert of, but I know that the process of revisiting traditional concepts is very present also there. So the problem is simple in a way, at least theoretically. So paradigms change, and established terminology simply does no longer grasp reality, right? So the dilemma that we face in all these circumstances is whether we should rather reinterpret the concepts, or whether we should rather do away with them and look for something else. Like, if you take the classical example of the term federalism, we all know how many attempts have been put forward to, adapt, change it, adopt something else. first it was regionalism, and then the multi-level governance, compound states, the multi-tiered system, and so on and so forth. So in general, I must admit, I do prefer to update concepts rather than inventing new ones. It's a kind of a adaptation of the concepts as they grow with society. But in this particular case, I like the approach of the law of diversity, which is one of these new concepts in a way, but it has also some innovative elements that goes beyond the frustration of dealing with concepts that are not completely fit for the changing reality, because it covers, in my view, the overlap of the two circles: federalism on one hand, minority rights on the other, and the common part of the circle is probably the law of diversity, or at least the core of the law of diversity. So I also like the normative aspects of law in managing diversity, because it is different from diversity management, which is another trendy kind of term which is used. I think diversity management is broader. It includes not only the law of diversity, but also a number of policies and actions and many other factors, while the law of diversity looks at the legal tools for managing diversity, which in my view is something which is needed. So to some extent, this is what Martina did when suggesting to move away from, the participatory or deliberative democracy and to adopt the term democratic innovations, which leads me to the second point, which has mostly to do with Martina's presentation. It's the fact that updating concepts is a process. Like federalism, it's a process. It's not something that occurs from one moment to the other, but it's something that evolves in a way. Federalism is really the closest we have to a constitutional tool to manage pluralism. And this is why federalism is important and is being rediscovered even by those who are not really aware of the fact that they are rediscovering federalism. Because the contemporary challenge, and we all agree with that, is to cope with the pluralization of societies. Societies are becoming more plural, not only in territorial terms, but also, and above all, I would say, because of the presence of many more groups claiming recognition, claiming a differentiated treatment, so claiming to be subject of the law of diversity in a way. And then more broadly, because of the presence of many more interest bearers, many more subjects who want to be heard. And if they are not heard, they can easily torpedo decisions once they are adopted by challenging them in courts, by making life very difficult to the implementing agencies, and so on and so forth. So it's clear in a way that the classical instruments of representative democracy are not enough, because they cannot simply contain all pluralism that contemporary societies tend to express. We all know this is a best kept secret among constitutional lawyers, who normally, are very devoted to parliament and the sacred institutions of democracy. But we all know at the same time that modern parliaments in Europe were born in the 19th century as a sort of a platform for compromise, essentially between only two interests, one of the bourgeoisie, of the growing bourgeoisie, and the one of the aristocracy. And that was simple in a way. But nowadays it is extremely difficult to, have these institutions as the representatives of pluralism in society. So many counterweights come up, but they very often kind of simply oversimplify instead of addressing complexity. And the example here would be direct democracy. Again, the logic of yes and no, black and white, which is problematic from the point of view of accommodating pluralism. So it's clear that pluralism, that federalism interlinks with democracy, and that such interrelation is obvious on one hand, but it's also problematic on the other hand. And this leads me to what Jared addressed, the link between federalism and democracy, and in particular participatory democracy. So I think Jared pointed out that they have a lot in common, and that there are also some theoretical challenges resulting from this relationship. Especially, I found particularly fascinating, we don't have time, but maybe in the discussion later on, the question that you posed as to whether federalism creates diversity rather than just managing it. That would be something that, in my view, should be addressed further. Well, when it comes to participatory democracy, I think participatory democracy is the best possible evidence for the theory of laboratory federalism that we all know. So federalism multiplies the spaces for experimenting institutional innovations, and now I deliberately use this term. And this is, in a way, perhaps the most relevant reason why such innovative instruments are more often used at a lower level, more than the issue of numbers. Martina rightly said, of course, it is easier to adopt participatory budgeting in a small town with 20,000 people than at the national level with millions and millions. That's obviously true. But I think what makes it more palatable, these instruments, is the fact that at the lower level is that one level can copy from the other, can ameliorate, can make some changes, etc., etc. So this also increases something which is imbued in federalism: cooperation on one hand and competition on the other. Because, of course, if you copy solutions, then it goes more into the direction of cooperation. And if you're striving for better solutions, then it is more competitive kind of relationship among the various federal subjects. So despite the many nuances and the distinctions in types of federalism and types of participatory democracy that Jared rightly pointed out, of course, the linkage between federalism and democracy, and participatory democracy even more, is evident. And I really believe in the theory of federalism representing the matrix for participation, because federalism is the oldest, more established, more developed instrument for territorial pluralism. And it is quite obvious that it inspires the solutions and procedures once one look for solutions for societal pluralism. So it is a different type of pluralism, but this is the best we have, and it is kind of natural to look at that. And to conclude, and perhaps this is what I would like to suggest also to Nicolò, perhaps in trying to further develop the idea of the law of democracy. What is really common among the various concepts that I have been dealing with today is participation. It might be true, and I'm actually convinced that Martina is right when saying that participatory democracy is not grasping all features of the phenomenon, and therefore it is better to speak of the democratic innovations. But the problem is to do away with the very key of the whole thing, which is participation rather than democracy. This goes for, again, both minority rights and federalism. The basic procedural right is participation. And this is the basis for all the material rights. If we think of, all possible rights of minorities and the claims that different groups put forward, all boils down to participation. So you don't need to have all your claims recognized, but what is necessary is to have a platform where you can pose your claims and see whether they can be accepted or not. So probably participation is what distinguishes the archipelago from the island, or the beautiful bridge that Jared showed at the end of his presentation. So I would really try to focus on participation rather than just democracy, if you allow me the provocation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco. You developed really interesting consideration and made absolutely gripping points, and you raised many issues. And I think this last point about participation is really challenging and interesting, because it seems to me that it could be another interpretive key, another interpretive concept that allows us to focus and deepen the relationships between federalism and the law of diversity. Perhaps with pluralism and governance, they as well, they refer to this idea of participation. And so really thank you very much. And I guess that the other interesting point you made is the idea of the pluralization of societies, that as far as I'm concerned, brings also a pluralization of legal concepts. And this is what maybe this pluralization of societies is bringing to federalism and minority rights, that they've been somewhat modeled on a model, on a paradigm that is we can describe it. We can describe it as a national paradigm. No, we are in this moment maybe experiencing pluralization of societies that pluralize our way of looking at them and our instruments to manage them. So thank you for these very interesting points. Now, maybe I would like to ask the speakers, Jared and Martina, if they want to maybe jump in to react to Francesco's comments. And then I see that there's a comment in our chat tab. I will start from that. And the floor is absolutely open. You can reserve your participation through the chat tab. Thank you very much. Martina, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Jared, and thank you, Francesco, for your interesting perspectives and views of this very complex issue. I think our presentations or our thoughts showed really that there is a lot of food for thoughts, and like there is a lot of further insights that I think that still needs to be addressed properly in future research. What I would like to address here, especially with regard to what Francesco said, has to do with the fact, as you properly pointed out, that that decision-making processes needs to be made more complex in order to reflect somehow the complexity of the society they are representing, right? Because I don't think that as you were saying, parliaments were born in the 19th century and had the function of representing very few specific interests. Nowadays, the societies are made of millions of different interests. And of course, this is what the law of diversity, I think, aims at, to proceduralize, I don't know if even if this is a word, to proceduralize tools in order to include different perspectives also in the decision-making process. And this is why I would like to highlight that the idea of using democratic innovation as a term is because this is exactly this goes in this direction. Democratic innovations, I think, are the proceduralization of the inclusion of different interests in the decision-making process. Because participation, as you were saying, in order to be made effective, needs to be proceduralized somehow, because if not, all these interests will not be able to enter the decision-making process and to be translated into effective decisions. So what is particularly interesting, in my view, about democratic innovations as procedures, as decision-making procedures, is this interaction with the traditional decision-making procedures, law-making procedures, and the way in which these democratic innovations can enter also through institutionalized methods, can enter the traditional decision-making process. Because we need to ask ourselves, how can we make this proceduralized? How can we proceduralize the different, the participation of so many interests in the decision-making process? And this is why I use this term democratic innovation, because I think this is a step forward in this very difficult task, but that I think is more than needed in order to transform decision-making process of representative institutions at all levels of government into something that really accommodate pluralism, instead of like using participation only as somehow an instrument to attract citizens to be more inclined to support one political interest or another. Because I think that participation needs to be included. Citizens really needs to be included into decision-making processes, and I think democratic innovations could be a way to make this possible.
Thank you. Please, Jared, I leave you the floor.
So once again, thank you very much from me, and an additional big thanks now to Francesco. I took a lot of notes. That was a very thought-provoking reflection. It's no exaggeration. I'm quite enthusiastic also. These ideas about participation, it's a strong argument, and taking a more dynamic and procedural perspective on federalism to say, to add into this as a form of participation, or a way of fostering participation itself. So I'm only reflecting what you said, and gladly take that with as a big food for thought for me. One thing I will briefly answer, because you'd asked about it, is how federalism can oversimplify create diversity. This might be a mirror to something I thought was a good comment you made too, as well, about the legacies we have of democratic institutions. some of them we invent them from a different time and space, and they can lose their meaning, or they can be adapted, but they might not adapt enough to the new form of complexity. And in a different way, or in a similar way, but viewed differently, at least in federal systems, so in this more structural sense, we may have a space and time where a federal system created these units that get locked in, but they create a kind of diversity that wouldn't otherwise be there. For example, let's take the German case that was always federal, even before there was the formal concept of federalism, but after the Second World War, new states were formed. And so there was nobody, and some of them had a historical basis like Bavaria, but North Rhine-Westphalia, there was nobody ever who was North Rhine-Westphalia before the creation of this system. Or the US that has two Dakotas that was born out of a conflict between Democrats and Republicans in the 19th century. And the Republicans wanted to have two more senators, so they cut a line in the middle of Dakota to now have 4 instead of 2 senators. I mean, that's really why there's 2. Those are 2 plastic examples of where diversity is created from a federal logic to a certain extent. And whether that's good or not is one thing, but that was more from his, I think we were on a similar wavelength there, but I was looking from an historical birth of units that then perpetuate a kind of diversity that wasn't even there before. So it did not accommodate diversity, it sort of created it and becomes institutionalized.
Thank you. Thank you for your reply to Francesco's comment. And now I will proceed to read the comment from our audience, from Mr. Khan. Mr. Khan says that he is slightly apprehensive about the conceptual stretching to accommodate or force-fit certain preconceived ideas regarding management of diversity, minority rights, and so on and so forth. So he points out that maybe conceptual stretching might be a thing we have to take into account when engaging with these considerations. And would you like to comment on this observation? Please feel free to switch on your microphone.
Maybe we could ask, I guess, Khan is Archie Khan, right? Old friend of us. In that case, he might perhaps elaborate more on that, because I see what he's afraid of, and indeed this might be a problem. The question is, what should be the alternative? So perhaps he might have a reply to that, but I'm not sure whether he's him or not.
If Mr. Khan want to jump in and maybe explain a little bit more his point of view, is absolutely welcomed. Let's see. Anyways, in the meanwhile, I will.
I'm so sorry about that. I was
No
just
problem.
guessing whether it was Archie or not, but it's sorry.
Maybe he will jump in afterwards. I'm sorry. This is not Archie Khan, and my mic is not working. If your mic will work, we absolutely would like to listen to your observation, and then we will engage with this. After maybe I read also Roberto Tognatti's comment. Roberto Tognatti says that he agrees with Martina in recognizing that democratic innovation may be instrumental for giving a role to what the US Supreme Court labeled as discrete and insular minorities that did not have direct access to political representations. And this is an interesting point, I think, because in fact, what links participatory democracy to the models for the accommodation of diversity, the emergent models for the accommodation of diversity, is the idea that maybe they allow they allow a far wider diversity to enter mechanism of decision making in general, of democratic decision making, because they are more flexible and they are more open in general. We have already experienced many examples of participatory democracy where, for example, migrants communities' interests are taken into account. There are many minority consultative bodies that express this function. So maybe this is really a good point. If you want to comment on these two observations coming from the audience, you are free to go on. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we can also add something about this idea of democratic innovations as being instrumental to a wider participation, or to the participation of minorities, or these many different interests that are present in the society. And maybe this is also a perspective through which we could look at federalism and democratic innovations in a similar way, because I think the big challenge of democratic innovations nowadays, as I was saying before, is to find out a way to really include these minorities, because this is not an easy task, because many times, this may be a little bit simplistic, it is said, okay, the participatory democracy and democratic innovations are a nice way to reimagine democracy, but still citizens are not keen to participate in many decision-making processes. So what is really important right now is to reimagine and to reinvent or invent procedures that really are able to represent the societal diversity and to include as many interests as possible in these procedures that are actually reinvigorating traditional decision-making processes. Because I think it is very important here to underline that democratic innovations are not replacing traditional decision-making processes, are only integrating them. So what is really important right now is to look at a way to really, as I was saying before, proceduralize these democratic innovations in a way that this could be an answer to this profound need of representation of diversity and diverse interests. So to this extent, looking at maybe how the proceduralization of federalism worked throughout the years and the decades could be somehow a way in which democratic innovations could learn how to institutionalize and proceduralize their ways of including different interests in the procedures they are suggesting.
And if Jared and Francesco don't want to add nothing else, I have immediately a reaction to your observation, Martina, because this absolutely brings the question of, do you think that federalism is useful to these aims? This is, I think, the concrete dimension of our research question. So is federalism in its rules, in its tools, in its trends, useful to provide a conceptual framework, but also some basis, some inspiration for the development of participatory democracy. I say this because there's in literature we often see that and we often acknowledge the persistent lack of a comprehensive theory, for example, of participatory democracy, and in general we observe rather descriptive accounts and not normative, or at least yes, proposing some development. So this is why I am asking this, because yes, practice are there and are growing and increasing in significance, but is really federalism useful to provide some models, to provide some rules and some inspiration? I think of the rules of federal countries, on federal systems that prevent a single center from abusing its position, for example, in favor of the other centers, or the progressive centrality of judges in general, the mechanisms in general for the prevention of and resolution of conflicts. And in general, also federalism and federal governments are experiencing a trend towards the integration of traditional institutions by new and less formal institutions. So if we accept that this deep connection, these premises are there, and maybe we can conceive example of the participatory democracy or democratic innovations as layers of decentralization of decision making, what are the consequences if maybe we are able to sketch some ideas? But absolutely, I know that this is the main challenge, but maybe something raises in your head. Thank you.
So just briefly, but maybe also Jared and Francesco can add something about that, because I feel that I would be optimistic on that. So I would say yes, the long, as Francesco was saying, the ancient history of federalism definitely could teach something to new phenomena, and that of democratic innovations is definitely a new phenomenon. And also these democratic innovations are proliferating so fast that I am sure that this will not be a satellite that will disappear in some years, because for example, citizens' assemblies at national level on environmental issues are being organized in so many European countries that it is really striking to see that these kind of instruments are being supported not only at the municipal level, not only at the subnational level, but really also at the national level of government. So I think many instances see in democratic innovations a future development for democratic procedures, and therefore I think, but maybe on this Jared and Francesco can help me a little bit, because they're definitely more experienced than me. Could federalism, I'm sure that in the beginning of the elaboration of federal theories, also federalism was kind of a satellite instrument. So I am sure that somehow the development of federalism into legal frameworks, into rules, into constitutional rules, somehow could show us a way how democratic innovations could become something more institutional, more procedural and not just something that somehow is seen as an ad hoc procedures adopted for a specific, I don't know, policy field.
Yeah, if there's yeah, one thing maybe as a more complement or addition to what you said along the lines of so thinking of the origins of federalism, also with a view to lessons. I think, okay, at the end of my presentation, I betrayed a little bit of a normative standpoint that I have, namely one that's a bit more communitarian in orientation than liberal individualist. And there's plenty of examples of where federalism, particularly the American model, has been associated with liberal individualism. It's also mirrored in the democratic model and some commonplace orientations, although that's not what Americans or Canadians are, but it's a commonplace and often found orientation. So this more individualist autonomy, not always competition, always be leave me alone, whether it's the government or the federal government orientation. And there's this idea that federalism also limits government. But as Martina pointed out, there's this also element of federalism dealing with, a form of rule. And I would add here that the origins of federalism are also ones that deal with compacts. So compacts of dealing with common problems. So not just ways of limiting the government. I mean, it's pluralizing centers of decision-making, but not only so that people will be left alone in their compartments, but that they have to work together. Now, it's a balancing act. And I like, again, bringing in this idea that federalism is a process too. I mean, it's an institutional form that proceduralizes or foresees procedural elements for groups, people, places, and their representatives also to coordinate. It should have some slack to work, some room for maneuver to allow spaces and places for people to do their own thing as well. But it's also a form of, I see very much where we could build a bridge here for in the sense of a law of diversity, creating processes for participation, but also common problem solving. That may be a bit different to an extent. There's a difference here maybe with regard to participatory democracy or many democratic innovations literature that are often likewise critical of conventional representative democracy or the liberal democratic model, the accumulative model of adding up votes that tries to see a more richer inclusionary way of getting people involved. But I think one thing to take away from federalism is also this idea of compact, and this over time. So it has commitment. And again, I betrayed some of my more normative standpoint where I feel more at home. That being said, I think there's also much reason to say that's what federalism teaches us as well, whether that's the lesson one likes or not. I think there's much there about federalism also being about commitment to communities.
Well, let me just add briefly that I tend to agree with Martina, and I also like to be optimistic and see the point I was already trying to make, that not only federalism is a process, but everything is a process in a way. Democracy is clearly a process, and all the concepts we are working with are processes. So the changes are gradual. And as a matter of several changes that pile up, at some point we end up with something new. It's like the formation of rocks, right? I am happy to see among the participants Professor Toniatti, and he and I have been discussing for quite some time also the issues of for example, cross-border cooperation, which is a perfect example of a new kind of law developing out of some institutional experiments, and by adding one experiment to the other, then all of a sudden you end up having a law of cross-border cooperation. There are already even some university courses being taught, and there is some form of promotion of this sort of new transnational law, etc., etc. So why should that not be the case with other areas? For example, the law of participatory or democracy or democratic innovations. It is something that is simply a bit newer and adds to what it used to be there, and slowly you end up building a building. And this is probably also the fate of the law of diversity, most likely. So we are kind of now intellectually struggling with something that we see the need for, and we do not yet have all the instruments to see how the final rendering of the project will look like. And if that is the case, this might perhaps address, at least partly, the concern by, well, Mr. or Mrs. I don't know now, Khan, because I was assuming it was a person I was knowing, but it's not this person, which is a very legitimate concern. Both in terms of doing away with established concepts might be risky, of course, because you might throw the baby with the dirty water, and also because you don't have the guarantee that federalism necessarily works for the development of democracy. You can even have the opposite examples, and we have them in some countries. But it's a sort of gradual development of instruments, and so in a way, this is probably a view of seeing things in motion, and not to be too afraid of changes that might happen.
Thank you very much. In fact, yes, there was another message from Mr. or Mrs. Khan, and it addresses really the idea of the relationships.
Oh, may I add to that last point, because I took a note and I couldn't read it. It was a quote from Bertolt Brecht, actually, who used to say, well, it was about communism back then, and said, well, ideas are not responsible of the use that human beings make of them. And you can also apply perfectly the same reasoning also to instruments such as federalism. So it doesn't prevent democratic abuses per se, if it is misused, but nevertheless, it is something that might be helpful.
I guess that this is a perfect conclusion for our webinar, and I really thank Francesco for that. And in fact, we are running out of time. This webinar is coming to an end, and I will take this last minute to thank you all for being here and for participating in this really intriguing webinar that raised so many questions and gave not that many answers, but it was not supposed to do that. And so I hope that you all will participate in the next webinar of this series that will take place on November the 10th at 9:30 a.m. and we will focus on federalism and legal pluralism. So I'm looking forward to it, and I really thank you all, and thank the speakers. Thank you, Jared, Martina, and Francesco. And so see you soon. See you at on the 10th of November. See you. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.